Hello, everyone. Paul Seils. I have with me Professor Olle Johansson. Thank you for joining us.
Oh, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. And for the uninitiated, I'm going to read some of your biography here. So Olle Johansson, Associate Professor at the Karolinska Institute, retired November 2017 and still active, Department of Neuroscience and head of the Experimental Dermatology Unit, has a long background in the neurosciences and has co-authored, together with his supervisor, Professor Thomas Hochfeld, and many others, including Nobel laureates, up to the presentation of his doctoral thesis, 143 original papers, reviews, book chapters, conference abstracts, publication records that are hard to beat. His doctoral thesis at the Karolinska Institute was entitled Peptide Neurons in the Central and Peripheral Nervous System Light and Electron Microscopic Studies. Thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you. And could we start there actually, because you actually hit a very important point without maybe realizing it, because as you just read, for the first decades, I was deeply involved in the central and peripheral nervous system, the brain, spinal cord, and the peripheral nerves, studying their content of various transmitter molecules, modulators, co-modulators, and so on. And I shouldn't say that we published in the very best journals every month, but it was close to it. And it wasn't uncommon, to have papers in the foremost academic journals, such as Science and Nature. And when I then presented my thesis and moved on, entering another field, namely as an experimental animal, humans, and then we started with normal healthy skin, normal healthy vaginal mucosa. We looked at oral mucosa, and we started to do some very interesting investigations. And people applauded that. They were very happy, and we were contacted by physicians that wanted to have various skin or mouth disorders investigated using our technologies. And of course, we were happy to collaborate with them. But then one day we hit the bottom, you can say, in the sense that we started to be interested in something that I coined as screen dermatitis, namely people that got skin rashes and irritations, pricking pain and so on, sitting in front of the newly introduced personal computer screens. And oddly enough, then suddenly behind my back, people started to say, that no, he's not the real scientist. He hasn't done anything. He don't know anything, and so forth. Until they discovered that, wow, Jesus Christ, he has published in journals such as Science, Nature, and whatnot. And I have a publication record still not beaten at the Karolinska Institute. And that really silenced people. I'm so very, very happy that I had the great opportunity and great luck, I would say, to come to Professor Thomas Hochfeld, as you mentioned, because that really made an enormously important groundwork for me. I became a real scientist thanks to that. And I also had all the publications with me that I could put on the table and say, hey, shouldn't I be a real scientist? What should I then do more? And of course, all these papers did silence this criticism, or at least moved it away from the public arena.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for being very much a real scientist, but also being held in such high regard in the community, particularly in the community in Australia, and holding your personal and professional opinion in such a high regard. And we're here to talk about the concerns that we have at the moment in relation to electromagnetic radiation, electromagnetic frequency, and the rollout of the 5G, fifth generation technology. I'm wondering if you can talk about what your position is in relation to that, and what your findings, what your concerns, etc., might be.
Well, as you said, I'm retired. So nowadays it is very difficult, of course, to perform any real high-class scientific work. But thanks to collaborations around the world, I am still involved in very interesting research projects, and they are still about 2, 3, and 4G. Regarding 5G, you know, I mean, there are practically no such telephones around in the world. Some infrastructure has been built. It has been in some towns and cities been tested for a short period, but that's about it. So we don't know anything really about 5G, and that also parallels, as you know, the discussion that was recently held in the United States Senate, where Senator Richard Blumenthal asked the telecom industry as well as their regulating authorities in the United States what kind of studies that have been performed proving safety for 5G. And after some hesitation, it turned out that there are no such studies whatsoever. It will be a gigantic rollout with a completely new technology, and based upon the previous versions like 4G, 3G, 2G, and even 1G, it would be much, much wiser not to roll out anything new at all, but to stabilize the critical question marks that we have around. And they are not few, you know, just a single literature database called EMF Portal in Germany has more than 28,000 publications that are relevant to your question, actually. And that tells a very important tale, I would say, and even more so when you look around in society and realize that practically all major big players, like, of course, the telecom manufacturers, the operators of wireless technology, and the World Health Organization, the radiation protection authorities, as well as all the insurance and reinsurance companies, have abandoned ship. And for some of them, more than 20 years ago. And I remember I was at a meeting in London in 2002, and there were, for instance, representatives of Lloyd's UK, Reassurance in Switzerland, which is one of the largest reinsurance companies in the world, and a small Swedish company called If Scandia. And they all cried out that for them, it wasn't a question whether there were dangers or not. They were sure that wireless irradiation was dangerous to living matter. And for them, the only question was who is going to pay for all the health claims in the future, and they didn't want to be part of that cost, you know. So therefore, they had bailed out from any form of responsibility regarding such health effects of electromagnetic fields. And not only wireless telecommunication, but all types of artificial electromagnetic fields. And, you know, that's more telling, I would say, than any test tube or a laboratory rat I could show you right now, because that's telling that they are withdrawing from these liability areas because they realize that there are dangers. There could be short-term as well as long-term damages to not only humans, but to other animals, plants, bacteria.
Absolutely, absolutely. And
but instead the market reacts to producing 5G, and they're already talking about 6G, and for some specific systems they're already up at 10G, and so the generations are shifting very quickly. And of course it's really not up to the industry or the operators. They are not responsible in that sense. Mom and dad are always in every country, our governments and parliaments and health authorities. They are the ones that should put their foot on the brake and say, hey, we need a moratorium. We really need to establish what kind of health effects we see, what effects we have on biological matter, including the smallest quantities like bacteria. And there is always two sides to a coin, you know, and some would even argue a third side, but two major sides, of course. And the good side could be that any country and any company that would look seriously into this, and I coined many years ago the sort of idea that we should develop tomorrow's green, human-friendly, and environmental-friendly technology, the country and company doing it will be the big sellers tomorrow. And there are such movements. Unfortunately, not in Sweden. I would love to see a Swedish company do it and sell it worldwide naturally, and you would like your country to do it. But the ones that are interested, I could just mention, for instance, Malaysia, United States, and above all, I would say Norway. There are quite a number of people in Norway very, very interested in this kind of discussions that we are having now and the kind of scientific results being presented. And I would also say that that's the most common target for a journey for me. That is to go to Norway and give a lecture, mostly behind locked doors.
Yeah, got it. Thank you.
So, I mean, maybe soon all cell phones, tablets, baby alarms and so on will be called Norwegian. Not only aircrafts, and airliners, but also all these gadgets. You never know.
Yeah.
And then, of course, Norway will be richer than Japan ever was.
Yeah.
And I guess they already are, actually, so.
Thank you for drawing your attention to it. We're always looking for solutions and opportunities to create solutions to the existing issues that we're facing as far as the technology is concerned, and having conversations with people about minimizing exposure to electromagnetic radiation, about not holding phones near their heads, about going cable for internet access and hard wiring, avoiding Wi-Fi minimization, EMR exposure as much as possible. We're starting to become so saturated in technology now, and then people are having conversations about launching HAPS technology, drones, Zephyr systems for sky, basically having cell phone towers in the sky, etc. as well. So it doesn't seem to be that we can reach a 0 point anywhere on Earth where electromagnetic radiation is not impacting at this point in time.
That's very true indeed, and the rapidly increasing exposure levels, of course, again, tells you that your government and parliament, they don't give a toss about all the scientific questions and results. And for me, that's in a sense more scary than the actual radiation at this point, because if this goes on in all scientific fields, that greed is always overriding knowledge and need, then it's just a matter of time until mankind makes a move that will actually kill life on this planet. And then the question is, will it be nanotechnology, a gene-modified organism, or will it be artificial electromagnetic fields? We don't know that yet, but it's a very strange way of approaching danger. A mother and father would never do it like that,
And I guess that's the concern as well. People are in the community are asking the question: is electromagnetic radiation, is that potentially becoming the version of asbestos of our generation? We're looking at things that we thought were previously safe, including things like glyphosate and in the food chain, etc., and now proving to be carcinogenic. What you can say around, like, what's your personal opinion on what we're facing as a species, as humanity, in relation to this carcinogen at the moment?
I mean, it could very well be that, as you say, it could be equal to asbestos or smoking or something similar, but it could also be much worse. And therefore, I go down on my knees every evening by my bed and beg to God to make me wrong, because I want to be wrong. I want all the scientists to be equally wrong. But, the statistical probability that more than 28,000 publications all would be wrong at the same time, no, there is no way it could happen. So we have to live with the realization that we have a lot of research data, but we need some action from mother and father, from government and parliament. And except for a few pretty lame movements, I don't see very much of that. And of course, I could understand that campaigners and activists and bloggers and whatever you call them, they do get upset and they ask for answers. And then I think it's even more scary coming back to this senator at the American Senate, at the top of the sort of world political arena. When he asks the same type of questions, there are no answers. There are nothing. And that's, I must say, is upsetting. To roll out and launch such a gigantic project like 5G without having any knowledge about health effects, that's very irresponsible. But it was the same for 4G, 3G, 2G, 1G, and before that, whatever you call it, you know. So it's not anything new. It just continues. And I say again, as a sort of mental fire brigade soldier, I want to be wrong. I don't want to see any smoke or fire. I want to be on the safe side. But when I look around, I see a lot of smoke, you know.
Yeah, that's it. And you know, as I said we held a recent symposium in Australia, and I said at the beginning of my presentation in the introduction, I think if anything, many of us probably owe an apology to many people, including yourself, the academics, the doctors, you know, and the technicians that have been speaking out publicly about this for a long time, and many of us haven't been listening previously.
Oh, that's very kind of you to say that, and very, very nice. Thank you so much indeed. And I mean, I've never had that thought that anyone should say that they were sorry, because I felt that people actually did listen. But of course, in the beginning, there weren't very many. And I usually tell people that the very first, I mean, I wouldn't even call it a lecture, but let's call it a lecture then. It was held underground here in Sweden in a bicycle shed in the wintertime, and it was freezing cold. I stood there trying, you know, to talk about the first outcome of the first experiments we had done. And, you know, my teeth, they were shattering towards each other because I was freezing, shivering so much. But after that, I sit here now with you. It's an enormous honor, you know. So I wouldn't sort of not have done this tremendous journey, but it has cost a lot, of course, indeed. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And that's our intention, is to educate and to get the word out, to educate as many people as possible, not to be fear-driven, but to be educated about the potential risks that are associated in relation to aspects of things like fertility, for example, and then the impact of long-term exposure to electromagnetic radiation, and getting the word out and speaking to people that are in the governments and the councils, etc. And
people very often ask me in any country around the world, what can I do as a private person, as a citizen? And you have really answered it, because you can always write to or phone to members of your parliament, members of your government, members of health authorities. You can, in most countries, maybe write something in a newspaper, a short commentary or a debate column or something. You can try to appear in radio programs, in bloggers, activist programs, in television programs, and do as much as you can, or at least ask your neighbor. And when I move around here in Stockholm, people don't know who I am, of course, and I had recently a very interesting experience. In front of me in one of the commuter trains, there was a pregnant young woman. She was maybe in the 5th or 6th month, and beside her was the young father or father-to-be, and she was looking in her smartphone on baby cribs, and suddenly she stopped and said, "Oh, this is perfect for the baby." And she started to read and look on whatever she had in her smartphone, and suddenly she stopped and said, no, look here. And she turned to her boyfriend or husband and said, "Look here, this looks dangerous. no, this is not the right bed for our baby. But then he said to her, well, honey, you know, we are in Sweden. There are no products here that are dangerous for children, that you have to realize. And quickly, I moved forward and said to them, but you have a gadget in your hand, which radiation has been cancer classified by the World Health Organization, not one time, but 2 times. So as consumers in Sweden, you are unfortunately lured, you know, there are much more to know about these gadgets. And the mother-to-be, suddenly she looked at a smartphone as if it would have been an Egyptian cobra, you know. And I guess in the evening, she probably threw it away more or less, you know. Yeah. And we talked quite a lot during the journey in the commuter train, and other people around joined in the discussion, and everyone was sure about that the radiation was actually dangerous, and the health authorities didn't tell them the complete truth. Yeah. And it's the democracy Sweden. You know, we are proud of having an open debate. You can access all political arguments and discussions and decisions and so on, or at least you believe you can, you know. Yeah. And there is an ongoing agenda, obviously, and it boils down to, I would guess, just a matter of greed, as always. And of course, greed will generate a lot of money building a very rich country, being able to support their citizens and so on. Again, at least 2 sides of every coin. But I think it would be grand to have the discussion up on the table and completely open, because after all, very, very, very few citizens in countries like Sweden are under educated or anything like that. I mean, people are smart, they're intelligent, they have read a lot, they understand, and they could definitely be sort of good partners in such a public discussion. But if the data and the knowledge are withheld from them, well, then it's hard to be an expert, of course.
Yes. So I'm going to ask you about some of the, so I've got from our community, Anchor Crosby's been kind enough to give us some questions for you as well. So if Professor Olle can please address what the neurological forecast is likely to look like in the long term if 5G is fully deployed.
Well, hopefully, as I said before, nothing will happen. It will turn out to be completely safe. But if we look on the previous versions like 4G, 3G, and so on, there is quite a big number of papers pointing to effects at the brain and spinal cord level, for instance, involving changes in the electrical activity, what we call the electroencephalogram. You have decreased concentration capacity. You have a decreased short-term memory. You have effects on nighttime sleep, etc. So there are quite a lot of both learning, memory, and behavioral alterations. And maybe that's the reason why some countries have the last 3, 4, 5 years put different types of bans on gadgets like cell phones and tablets in schools. Countries such as the Solomon Islands, Nigeria, Uganda, etc. But unfortunately, I don't see the same type of bans, for instance, here in Sweden. And since I have a lot of prejudices with me in my life, I always get a little bit stressed finding Sweden trailing behind a lot of countries which I wouldn't have guessed were that advanced when it comes to public health issues. But we are. We don't have any such bans whatsoever. And still in Sweden, you know, parents love their children. They put on them helmets, bicycle helmets, colorful overalls, reflective vests, and so on. But when it comes to the effects of electromagnetic fields from cell phones, tablets, and other things, they are completely naked. And that, of course, stresses me. And that could mean, taken together, that in certain countries like Sweden, for instance, we might see an active dumbing down of the population with a reduction in memory capacity, reduction in concentration capacity. And when I lecture in schools at various levels in the schooling system, that's definitely the most common comment I get from teachers, that they have such a big problem to educate the children because they have problems themselves with concentration, memory, etc. So, I mean, we are talking about pieces in a three-dimensional jigsaw puzzle, and you don't have to have any type of rocket science to see that they could tie together into a complete image. And that image is pretty scary, I would say. And I'm still surprised, you know, if I was the Prime Minister of Sweden, I would definitely put a ban in schools and higher up in the educational system. But also I would put the complete moratorium on all these systems until I could raise a green flag. But right now there is a very red banner flying in the wind, you know.
Yeah, yeah. Definitely, and since I've had my attention on it as well, there's definitely an issue there with children and having, you know, what people are just classifying as ADHD, attention and deficit disorder, etc.
And you know that you have some extremely interesting papers, starting with George Carlo was the first to put emphasis on the possibility that artificial electromagnetic fields could be associated with autism and other similar issues regarding children. And then later on, Martha Herbert and Cindy Sage wrote two fantastic papers about the same thing. And the discussion is definitely on the table. And I see more and more teachers, especially, and people in the schooling system that now cries out and say that we have to take away all these gadgets just from an educational point of view, because the kids' concentration are on the games and the surfing on the internet and so on, instead of paying attention to what the teacher actually says.
Yeah.
And then on top of that, you have the radiation effects, and we are not talking about any amateur scientists here. And the radiation effects when it comes to concentration and short-term memory has been studied by Professor Henry Lai, who is the #1 in the field, you know, really, and his collaborators at University of Washington in Seattle on the west coast of the United States. And they have been on the table for, wow, it's 25 years or something like that. And still, and it has been replicated, you know, I'm forgetting on human boys, when they were exposed to cell phone radiation in a blind coded system, they did less well in a linguistic test or task they should perform. And again, you know, when I look on the schooling system in Sweden, Sweden is a very small country, as you know, but we should compete on a global market. And then we need to be top notch, I would say, when it comes to education and understanding and knowledge. And instead we give the pupils all these gadgets, actively possibly dumbing them down, you know.
Yeah, yeah. So speaking into that as well, like, what would you like to see there in relation to solutions? I mean, we've seen it happen previously with tobacco, etc., where there's warnings that are placed, where people that want to carry out that activity are isolated to a certain location. Do you see, as far as solutions moving forward, that these devices are actually be given radiation, energy output ratings, etc.? That I mean, how do you? What sort of solutions would you see would work moving forward?
That's definitely a way to go forward, to enclose some kind of information package. And also, I shouldn't forget that here in Sweden we have a new company called RP of Sweden, and that means Radiation Protection of Sweden. And they have developed a case for your cell phone, for your smartphone, which reduces the radiation up to more than 99% without impacting negatively on the battery capacity or the connectivity. A fantastic product, actually. And it has been independently tested in Finland by one of these very best technical laboratories called Verkotan. So it's not the producers who has come up with these figures, but it's an independent measurement. And it only costs like, well, 40, 50 American dollars is a very cheap thing to put on your cell phone, and then reduce as much as you can, as you said before, as sort of citizen and consumer. You can do a lot actively by writing to, etc. But you also want to protect your family and yourself. And this is definitely one of the ways to go forward. And if you Google RP of Sweden as one single word, you would find their web page, and you can order it all over the world.
Mm. And also maybe, sorry, you go.
No, please, you go ahead.
Also, maybe limiting use of these devices by children under a certain age, like 15 or something, for example. Is that?
Yes. Yeah, I mean, already, and I'm trying now to remember, it was 2009, I think. Then we wrote the so-called London Resolution, and there we pointed to that children under 16 even should only be allowed to use these kind of wireless gadgets for emergency calls, nothing else. And of course, you know, again, mothers and fathers, they love their children, and they want them to be at the forefront in their schooling system, and therefore they give them a lot of, for instance, computers, laptops, tablets, cell phones, and whatnot, instead of more hours together with adults. Because if they want them to become a new Albert Einstein, that's exactly what children need. They need guidance from an adult, not a lot more of gadgets. And you know, when Sweden some years ago, it's like 4 or 5 years ago, they did a massive investigation among children up to the age of 14, and they asked them what they wanted most in their life. Was it a new bicycle or a new laptop or a new cell phone? The most common answer was more time with mother and father.
Yeah.
Followed by more time with teachers. So even kids react to this technocratical society, and I think it's time for human development to consider taking a few steps backwards without sort of indicating that we are afraid of technology or anything about that. It's nothing to do with that kind of labels. I'm afraid that we are losing a battle when it comes to teaching, as well as you said before, there could be other long-term health effects, like on the immune system, infertility, and above all, the genotoxic effects, the damage to the DNA molecules, which has been shown so many times and replicated in such a detail, so that you must live with. These gadgets and their radiation, they do impinge on the DNA molecules and harming them. And the question is, what will that mean in the future? And again, coming back to the ship called society, since most of the crew has abandoned ship many, many years ago, how should we do this when we have future, for instance, cancer patients who would have legal demands on the society to get compensation for the fact that they have got a brain tumor due to their cell phone. On the ship, they are themselves there, their relatives, and the rest of the public society, like the government and the parliament. But the ironic thing is that when they will get money from, for instance, their health authorities, it's actually their own money, because in Sweden, it's just by taxation that we run the whole social system, including governments and parliaments. So actually, they will get money from themselves.
It's interesting.
And the profit went overboard like 20 years ago, you know.
Yeah. It's interesting you should say that as well. Also in relation to that, having the conversation with people around this technology being rolled out, and people asking the question like, who's funding it? So in Australia, I don't know how it happens in the rest of the world, but in Australia, a lot of the infrastructure has been 50% funded by the government. So that's indirectly, you know, a form of taxation that people have contributed to. And then there's the other aspect of the technology that of the individual companies that people perhaps have invested, whether they know it or not, from their self-managed super fund, their superannuation funds, into those companies that are actually perpetrating the rollout of the technology as well. So if people can get a bit more educated about where their investments are going and what they're being a bit more conscious about what they're contributing towards as well.
Yeah. And at least in Sweden, there is a lot of talk about ethical stocks and bonds, for instance. You should not allow your money as a taxpayer to enter criminality or prostitution or the military sector or anything like that, you know.
Yeah.
But a lot of these wireless techniques are actually used to produce and transmit, for instance, pornography. I mean, Jesus Christ, more than 50%, I read, of the connected computer time worldwide is used for pornography. And people don't know that, you know, and I think more and more of these cards needs to be turned over. And we have to start a debate. Is this exactly what we wanted to have, particularly when kids ask for more time with mother and father?
Yeah. Well, we're going to continue turning the cards over. So just the further to Anka's question is also, how does signal interference occur with our own biological frequencies, how it affects human neurological processes?
Oh, that's a brilliant question, you know, and that has been debated and studied for quite a long time. You know, these systems, they are pulsed, and they also have, like in your handheld cell phone, various electronics, the battery system and so on, and they give off extremely low frequency fields like 8 hertz, 16 hertz, 32 hertz, 217 hertz and so on, and all of them are actually exactly in line with your internal bodily waves, like for the frequency of your heart, the electroencephalographic activity of your brain, etc. So that's a very, very relevant question. And most likely the question actually could be turned into the answer: why do people see alterations like in the electrical activity of the brain? Why is the cell phones affecting nighttime sleep, concentration, learning, etc.? That's most likely not due to the microwave component, but to these extremely low frequency pulsation fields.
And I guess
that's a very, very important question. Yes.
Thank you. And I think that's the thing as well, is like further to that question, there's a lot of people that are sort of saying, particularly in the mainstream, oh, they said that about 3G and they said that about 4G. You know, can you say a little bit more about what, I know we touched on it previously, about what the signs and the symptoms are, and are there some people that are more vulnerable than others?
Oh, wow. That's also a very important and interesting question, because, as you know, very early people came forward, and many scientists mean that the physicist Nikola Tesla, he was the very first example of a person with what we nowadays would call electron hypersensitivity. And sometimes when I think about today's electron hypersensitive people, and you know, worldwide we talk about somewhere in the order of 350 million people worldwide that are electron hypersensitive. And sometimes, you know, when I meet them and when I talk to them and we sit down and have discussions, I feel that they are actually not electron hypersensitive. They are actually normal. They have a normal avoidance reaction, which you would see in any biological system which would be exposed to toxic environments. They would avoid it. And the question is whether, for instance, myself, am I electron hyposensitive? And therefore, may I be the long-term loser? Because the electron hypersensitive people generally speaking, they don't buy and use laptops and cell phones and baby alarms and smart meters and so on. It's actually people like myself who would be using it. And maybe 30 years down the line, wake up one morning with a terrible headache, and 2 days later being under the surgeon's knife because you have got a brain tumor. So, wow, that's a very, very interesting arena to discuss. Who are actually the canary birds in the coal mine? Is it actually the electrohypersensitive people that are the biological warning system, or are they just being normal and through their behavior telling us that you and I and all the others should also step away? And then we come back to the governments and parliaments. Doesn't that tell them actually that they should turn it off?
Which is interesting. It leads us to the next part of her question as well. Are there tests that the average person can get done to show damage, potential damage from radiation, electromagnetic radiation?
No. There are no such tests yet. But I'm trying actually to collect money. I have sent out a call, and one of the projects will be exactly about that, to come up with a kind of simple test system, like, for instance, a type 2 diabetes patient could himself or herself in their home test the blood sugar level by a very simple test and a very simple machine, which is cheap to use and gives an answer within a few seconds, actually. That's the kind of development you would like to see. And, well, if we could get the money together, or win the lottery or something like that, that's definitely something I would like to do. And also, that could be used to address senates, parliaments, governments, TED Talks, television shows and so on stage, to be able to directly show the effect of these types of artificial electromagnetic fields. Might actually be more impressive for the sort of lay person than the tests we have today, which are much more complicated and above all much more expensive and needs big laboratories and equipment and so on. No, I would love to see that. Just I don't know the English for that, but you can test the pH using something we would call in Sweden lackmus paper. Just a strip of paper, and it turns into different colors depending on the pH of the solution. Wow, that would be lovely to have a system like that,
Yeah. Which is interesting. I'll get that link off you to post in this interview as well, so people that want to contribute can do so towards that.
That would be fantastic, because we are really struggling, and we are very hopeful, to be honest, and we look very positive on this, because after all, I have the feeling that 1 or 2 or 3 countries will wake up, and maybe while we are talking, there is a bunch of young men and women in a garage in California actually inventing tomorrow's human and environmental friendly technology. And I would love to see that being launched onto the market. And maybe tomorrow we will have cell phones and laptops that are completely different. I mean, we can just not imagine how they would run. As my grandmother would have been, of course, in the same situation. Had I shown her a cell phone, she wouldn't have believed her eyes, of course.
Yeah.
So I'm very hopeful, and if people get together, and I don't think we sort of lack, well, in Sweden we would call it mental capacity. I think we have good brains enough. We have listened very carefully to lay persons as well, because many of them are very, very smart, very intelligent. They come up with brilliant ideas, and we would love to test them, but to do it in a meaningful way, in a correct and independent way. Then again, we need economical support, of course.
Yeah, we do. And as I said, I'll post your link. If you can send me your link, I'll post it in this interview as well. So
yes, please, yeah.
The community, because that's what we're really up against as well, in relation to give people idea of what we're up against. I mean, one of the hardware manufacturers for 5G alone, Ericsson, are putting up a publicity and promotional fund of about $370 million. Verizon, who is just one of the companies alone in the US for the year 2019, are spending something like $19 billion on 5G and infrastructure just in 2019.
You know, just a quick comment to that. I think that's very important information you come up with there. I was not aware that the figures were so gigantic, you know, they're colossal really. And if I was the kind of CEO of one of these big companies, I would of course be aware of that there are scientists like myself telling the general audience that there are question marks here. And as I said before, there is quite a lot of smoke around the horizon. And the question is, what does this smoke represent? And since I, as the CEO, would believe in my project being completely safe, because that's what I tell everyone, you know, all companies tell the consumers that their projects are 100% safe, then it must be 100% safe to give Olle Johansson all the necessary monetary resources he needs, because in science we have a general rule saying that all roads lead to Rome, you know. If it is safe, then I and other scientists will prove it beyond any doubt. But now we don't have the resources. We sit, you know, I'm trying my best, really, but it's of course a rather meager situation. And then the risk is that we come up with wrong answers because we don't have the best scientists, the best equipment, the best laboratories. And in the meantime, you are talking about millions and billions of US dollars, you know, being spent on advertising. And for instance, I could tell your viewers and listeners that at the Arlanda, the Stockholm Arlanda International Airport, they have kind of wallpapered it with ads from 5G Ericsson. It just looks crazy, you know. There is not a single surface that is not covered with that kind of ads for 5G. So they do believe in the safety of their product, but I could tell your audience it hasn't been very safe in my life to be engaged. We have had a lot of serious problems, really, and the personal cost has been tremendous. I cannot lie about that. And that tells me that maybe these safe products are not that safe. And no one seems to believe that in the insurance sector, the World Health Organization, the radiation protection authorities, the operators and the manufacturers. They don't believe it either, you know. And at this meeting I mentioned before in London, they didn't try to hide that. They were 100% outspoken. They said that there are dangerous, very dangerous effects, including cellular and molecular damages to living cells. They were aware of that, and they just didn't want to be part of the future cost split between different actors, you know.
Wow. And just the last part of Anka's question is in relation to, that leads into your comments there, is how can we protect ourselves to mitigate the risks?
Again, I mean, it's kind of a personal question in the sense that each person must do what they think is the best. And I could honestly say that I'm a little bit stressed sometimes. I will give you a story from 2009, November in California. I was invited to give 2 lectures at the meeting. I think it was in the order of 300 campaigners, activists, and other experts. And they were all campaigning against cell phone technologies and similar wireless systems. And I had one lecture before lunch and one after lunch. The first lecture before lunch went very well. I was very pleased. And then there was a lunch break for an hour. And then I was supposed to start again. And I could repeat what I said then, because I had to rearrange my second lecture and start by saying, I cannot believe in you any longer. You lost your credibility completely during the lunch break because everyone went outside and used their cell phone.
Mm.
The very thing you were complaining about, protesting against and so on, you all used.
Mm.
And I have to tell you that actually most of the people at the meeting, they looked ashamed. And I said, it's a little bit, like protesting against childhood pornography,
yeah.
and then watching it a little bit, No, you cannot do that.
Mm.
Your credibility went down the drain. And so you have to rethink. And I think that's the start of my answer to your question. You have to make up your end point. Where do I want society to go? And how should I help it to travel to that point? And then you look around, and the question is, why do I need all these gadgets and my children and so on? And why didn't William Shakespeare and Albert Einstein and the Nobel laureate Selma Lagerlöf, they never had these things. They didn't have a ballpoint pen, and they are still unparalleled in supremacy in their respective fields. And maybe it's something else that we need in society. And if you believe that, well, then I suggest you take away all the wireless gadgets in your home, your workplace, places at leisure and so on, and you tell people to turn them off, and in respect to your needs and so on, and you buy, if you sort of have to use a cell phone, maybe you should buy one of these Swedish cases from RPO Sweden to bring it down in the order of 90 to 99%, and so on, you can have shielded cabling, you can use fiber optics and whatever, I mean, there are a lot of technical developments, and it's just up to each user to decide how far do I want to take this, and maybe move to Sweden, because here in Sweden, as I said, Sweden is a small country population-wise. We are in the order of 10 million people, but it's actually one of the largest countries in Europe when it comes to its surface. So most of Sweden is completely empty. And that means that the operators do not expose these empty areas. So there you can actually live if you want to get away from the exposure, at least to quite a high degree. And I guess in Australia, you probably have a huge portion of your country that is not covered by telecom masts. But as you said in the beginning, with all these satellite systems,
and
well, there maybe it will be a different situation.
Well, I'd like to be able to make it to Sweden one day. And so from our discussion earlier, you haven't been to Australia since 1980. So hopefully we can get you down under to Australia at some point in time in the future.
Well, that would be a great honor, of course, and I have a huge number of people, both in Australia and New Zealand, that writes to me, and they have very, very good questions and comments, and it would be lovely to meet at least a few of them,
Yeah, absolutely. So anything you'd like to leave us with parting comments?
I think the parting comment would be that I'm very, very thankful to you, Paul, but also to all your viewers and listeners, because as I said, over the years, they have been really the propping pillars that has kept me on my feet, because the opposition has been tremendously hard at times, and without you and others, I don't think I have been sitting here,
Yeah, thank you. And I mean, I'm just a bit of an aggregator of information, but there's many people all throughout Australia, New Zealand, and the rest of the world that are contributing in many ways, different shapes and forms in relation to even having a subtle conversation with people, the people that are doing letterbox drops, people that are writing letters to their councils and municipalities, people that are going to rallies, people that are writing songs, people are doing so many things on so many levels.
Yeah. Now, all of this is equally important, and as I said before, I have my own take on this by always in the Stockholm public transportation system you know, they don't get away. I always lean forward and say, hey, that cell phone you have there, are you aware of that World Health Organization in Geneva has actually cancer classified it?
Mm.
And then people start thinking, you know. So you can start an avalanche by just a single pebble, really.
Mm. Absolutely. So that's great to close out on, actually. And just in relation to that, I wanted to acknowledge you and thank you for your contribution.
Thank you.
Of being one of the leading, and also all the other scientists and professors and doctors, academics and technicians around the world that are highlighting these concerns. And thank you for your contribution to humanity, and thank you for not abandoning ship and being with us, sir.
No, I love the sea, actually, you know, so I will never abandon the ship. And in Sweden, scientists like myself, they are governmental, meaning that I'm paid by the taxpayers, and that can never be misunderstood.
Mm-hmm. I've got it. Thank you. Professor Olle Johansson, thank you for your time. It's been an absolute honor.
Thank you.
Thank you.